Well, I thought it would be interesting to look at the 1916 Rising from a different angle. I figured there'd be loads of books. Next year is the centenary of the Rising, and I figured there'd be a lot of books about 1916, and most of them would probably be talking about, the glorious uprising and it led to the foundation of the state, all of which is true. But I also thought, at the time, the Rising wasn't popular with the citizens of Dublin, and I thought it would be interesting. It would be interesting to tell the story from the viewpoint of two kids, one of who is on the side of the rebels because their dad is an officer, but the other kid is the son of a policeman. And several of the Dublin Metropolitan Police were shot the first day of the Rising. They were an unarmed police force and they were withdrawn to barracks. And I thought, from the point of view of that character, the Rising would be a total disaster. So I thought it'd be really interesting if you had two kids who were great friends, but on the first day of the Rising, their fathers are on completely different sides. And how did the two kids negotiate that problem? And that would make for a very interesting story. I researched for the book the way I always do. I went back in time. I always try to recreate the world in which my characters are going to live. So I go back to when I was 12 or 13. I was really interested in pop songs of the day. So I reckon my characters in 1915 would be exactly the same. So I went back and found out what were the popular songs of 1915, what else was going on in the world, what was going on in the cinemas. I tried to recreate the world of 1915. And obviously the historical parts have to be accurate. So I found out about people. I had a great aunt who worked in an ammunition factory, and I remember her talking about that when I was a kid. So I had some personal family memories to draw upon, and then I did the usual research online and in libraries and so on. I always try to talk to people who lived through the events if I possibly can, but obviously that's difficult with 1915, 1916, because obviously most of the people are dead, if not all of them, at this stage. But I did have family memories of my own. My own granny, which I thought was interesting, never referred to the Rising as the Rising. She always referred to it as the Rebellion. And there's a subtle difference there, which I thought was kind of interesting, that a lot of people regarded this as a rebellion and a bit of a stab in the back. And it was only after the British began executing the 1916 leaders that the mood shifted. So I thought I'd try to feed all of those elements into the story while not getting the story bogged down with that and still keeping it an adventure story that would have the reader hopefully turning the pages. I generally do one book a year. Now, it wouldn't take me a whole year to write the book, obviously. So I'd spend several weeks researching it, coming up with the characters, coming up with the plot, checking out the music and all the stuff that was going on. And I'd spend weeks doing that stuff before I'd start doing any writing. The actual physical writing of the first draft probably took about 3 months. And then I go back and do loads and loads of rewrites before I hand it in to my publisher. And then your editor will come back with some notes, and there was nothing terribly dramatic had to be changed, but there were some good suggestions to tweak the story. So that would take a few weeks to do all of that. And then you give the notes for the cover designer. So the whole process takes about a year, but the actual physical writing of the first draft, about three to 4 months. Probably the book I wrote that's set in 1969, the first year of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, because I was a teenager, a teenager myself at the time. So while with all the other books I was really stepping into the time travel machine and going back like 100 years, whatever, in that one I was going back less than 50 years. So I remember the songs, I remembered the incidents that were going on. So that one was really interesting because in a way I was kind of reliving my own youth. So I found 1969 a really interesting year. But I love I love going back in all the time periods of the 20th century, because I think while it's historical, it's not so far back in time that we don't have people who lived through it, and they lived lives that were not completely divorced from how we live. Like there were trams and telephones and gramophone records and so on. So it's not like writing something from the Middle Ages, which would be totally alien. The 20th century is far back enough to be history, but not so far back that it's not beyond people's remembrance. So I find that really interesting. I usually try to have a really strong female character in my books, and I think that's kind of interesting because then you can bring up, because there wasn't equality in those days, if you're going to have a female character who's strong, she's going to come up against resistance, because that's just the way it was. And drama and conflict are the very essence of storytelling. So when I wrote Across the Divide, I brought in the whole thing about the suffragettes and women looking for the vote, and I had my character Nora asking her that, well, why can't women have a vote? and he's giving these kind of half-baked, slightly evasive answers, and she's pushing the boundaries a little bit. So I think that always makes for interesting storytelling. So yes, I always try to have female characters and male characters, and usually the female characters are maybe a little bit ahead of their time in their views, and that, as I say, I think makes for interesting storytelling. Probably Ken Follett. He's written a wonderful is it trilogy of books about. He's taken the history of the 20th century, and he's taken 3 or 4 families, starting with the First World War and going up to the Cold War. And it's a mammoth task, but the books are so entertaining. They're like thrillers. They're page turners, and yet they're dealing with the First World War and the Second World War and the Cold War, seen through the eyes of these 4 or 5 families. And I just think he's a terrific storyteller, and the research and all really feels like he's got everything right. So I've absolutely loved those books. Now, they're not children's books; they're for adults, but they're terrific historical fiction. Well, I do a couple of different kind of talks just to keep it sort of fresh for myself. The first talk I do is where I talk about how a historical fiction book like Friend or Foe or Across the Divide is actually written. So I talk about how I think up the plot, how I populate it with characters, the way I create my characters to try and make them interesting, how I go back in time and check out all the information, how the idea itself must be a really strong idea, because it must be something I feel passionate about. I'm going to spend a year of my life with his characters, so it has to be something that I find really interesting, that I think the reader will find interesting. So I tell about how I go about that. I tell about the actual process, how long it takes, designing the covers and so on, and usually the kids are really interested in all of that. The other talk I give is more sort of the personal thing of what it's like to be a professional writer, and I tell them, how I sit at my desk at 9 o'clock each morning, I work till lunchtime, I take a break for an hour, I work till 6 o'clock, I don't only write when I'm feeling inspired and so on, and I tell them the structure of a writer's day and what a writer's life is like, and how I came to be a writer, and they usually have loads of questions about, where you get your ideas from and so on. So I find that almost always there's a huge number of questions. What I would usually do is I would give a little bit of a talk about a writer's life and how I do the books. I would usually read a scene from one of the books, usually an action scene to keep their attention, and then we would do a questions and answer session, and generally they'll have loads of questions, and then we'll do photographs and book signings and so on. And I think it's great. Anything that makes reading seem like a cool activity for kids is good in my book. So I like going to schools, and it's great to meet your readers too, because writing obviously it's a solitary occupation. So a lot of the time you're sitting in the room by yourself. It's really nice to go into the schools and meet the people who are reading your books and get feedback from them. And usually they're absolutely straight with you. They don't pull any punches. And if they like it, they'll let you know. If they don't like something, they'll let you know that as well. And I find it really entertaining to meet the kids in the schools.